Americans, I'm in California right now, exploring your national parks, exploring your beauty, and we owe you an apology in Europe. This place is incredible. Check it out. That is Sequoia, and that is Hume Lake. Talk about beauty, talk about Mother Nature. America is incredible. I can't wait to explore more.
Europeans who are here for the World Cup are falling in love with America, not the American government. Don't get it twisted. Our cities, culture, natural beauty, amazing. But a president that 82% of Europeans think is a threat to democracy, that is what is holding America back. Yes, the videos of Scots in Boston are fun and a reminder that we should be grateful for our country, but tourists always see the best side of places, not the worst. And the worst side of America is our 35% approval rating corrupt president.
What if the America you were warned about disappeared the moment you actually lived there? Why would free refills, effortless returns, Sunday shopping, and a kitchen sink with its own motor leave European visitors questioning everything they expected? The real surprise is not that America feels different from the headlines. It is how quickly its strangest everyday conveniences begin to feel completely normal, and how uncomfortable life can feel once you have to give them up. The bottomless surprise. A European visitor can spend months hearing America discussed through headlines about cost, conflict, crime, politics, and social tension, then lose that entire mental picture over something as ordinary as a restaurant soda. The surprise begins when the glass is barely half empty and a server casually brings more without announcing a second charge, without turning it into a special favor, and without acting as though anyone has just requested access to the Federal Reserve. That little refill looks trivial until you compare it with everyday dining habits across Europe. In France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, free unlimited soft drink refills are far less common in ordinary restaurants, and another drink usually means ordering another drink. Nobody's being stingy, because the service culture simply developed differently, with smaller servings and clearer separation between each item purchased. That is why the American habit can feel almost comically generous to someone seeing it for the first time. What makes this interesting is not the soda itself, because nobody crosses an ocean for cola. The real cultural surprise is the American idea that hospitality should remove small annoyances before the customer even has time to notice them. A server sees an emptying glass and fixes the problem, while the guest keeps talking, eating, or watching the table disappear under plates that already seem determined to feed an entire Little League dugout. That kind of casual generosity rarely makes international news, which is exactly why it catches visitors off guard. The America people meet in headlines is usually America at its loudest, while the America they meet at lunch can be strangely easygoing, attentive, and generous in ways that never become a global talking point. Nobody writes a dramatic newspaper column because a waitress refilled iced tea before being asked, yet those tiny moments often reshape an impression faster than 1,000 arguments online. There's also something deeply American about refusing to make abundance feel ceremonial. The server does not present the refill like a luxury upgrade, and the customer does not react like they have won a prize. It is simply treated as normal service, which may be the most surprising part for visitors accustomed to counting every bottle or ordering another glass separately. America has somehow made "would you like more?" feel less like a sales question and more like a reflex. After living with that rhythm for a while, the appeal becomes easy to understand. You stop calculating every sip, stop wondering whether another drink is worth adding, and start enjoying the meal without treating hydration like a minor budgeting exercise. For patriotic Americans, that probably sounds almost laughably ordinary, because it is ordinary. Yet through European eyes, the ordinary part is exactly what becomes memorable. Because one bottomless glass quietly reveals a culture that often prefers generosity first and paperwork later. And once that expectation becomes familiar, paying for every additional glass back home can suddenly feel surprisingly formal, like receiving an invoice for borrowing the ketchup again. Sunday stays open. Sunday morning in America can quietly ruin a European visitor's tolerance for planning ahead. You wake up, realize there is no milk, remember you need shampoo, decide you want burgers tonight, and none of these discoveries requires an emergency family meeting around the kitchen table. Somewhere nearby, a supermarket, pharmacy, hardware store, or big box retailer is probably open, and Americans treat that possibility with the same excitement they reserve for checking the mailbox. That casual access feels very different if you come from Germany, where Sunday shopping is still tightly restricted, and the principle of Sunday as a protected day of rest is rooted in German constitutional law. Most regular retail stores close, with exceptions for places such as railway stations, airports, certain bakeries, and specially authorized Sundays. In England and Wales, the Sunday Trading Act allows large shops over 280 square meters to open for only 6 consecutive hours between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. America generally approaches the day with far fewer nationwide restraints, leaving hours largely to states, local rules, and individual businesses. The cultural difference becomes addictive because it changes the way people think about time. An American household can discover at 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon that the bathroom faucet has started leaking and still have a reasonable chance of buying a wrench, plumber's tape, and whatever mysterious little fitting Home Depot insists has 17 nearly identical versions. Dinner plans can change at 5. A child can suddenly need poster board for Monday morning. Somebody can remember at 9 that the dog is out of food. Daily life throws curveballs, and American retail culture often answers them by keeping the lights on. That convenience has shaped expectations so deeply that many Americans barely recognize it as a luxury. The remarkable part is not shopping itself. It is the freedom from arranging ordinary life around the opening hours of shops. You can be forgetful, spontaneous, disorganized, or simply unlucky, and the system often gives you another chance before Monday morning arrives. There is something wonderfully American about that second chance. European Sunday restrictions have their own logic, especially around worker protections, family time, and preserving a slower weekly rhythm, and many people genuinely value them. America simply made a different bargain. It placed enormous cultural weight on accessibility, consumer choice, and the idea that services should fit around people's schedules rather than expecting every schedule to fit around the store. Once visitors become accustomed to that rhythm, the dangerous part begins. Sunday stops feeling like the day when you must remember what you forgot on Saturday. It becomes another day when a random craving, broken showerhead, empty refrigerator, or last-minute barbecue can still be rescued. Then somebody goes home, discovers the supermarket shutters are down, and suddenly understands why Americans become personally offended when a store closes at 7. America takes it back. Here is a distinctly American sentence that can sound almost irresponsible to someone unfamiliar with the culture. If you don't like it, just take it back. Not because it is broken, not because somebody shipped the wrong item. Sometimes you bought the shoes, wore them around the house, looked in the mirror 3 more times, and eventually admitted that your feet had made a terrible financial decision. In many American stores, that can still be enough reason to walk back to the counter with a receipt and ask for a refund. For European visitors, the fascinating part is the legal paradox behind this habit. European Union consumers actually enjoy strong statutory protections, including a 14-day withdrawal period for most purchases made online or away from business premises. Yet when something is bought inside a physical shop, and there is nothing wrong with it, EU law generally does not give customers an automatic right to return it simply because they change their mind. Individual retailers can voluntarily offer that privilege, of course, and many do. America developed an almost opposite cultural instinct. There is no sweeping federal rule forcing every retailer to accept perfectly good merchandise merely because the customer reconsidered, yet generous voluntary return policies have become deeply woven into American retail competition. That is where this gets wonderfully American. Stores are effectively saying, "We trust you enough to make buying this easy." Retailers know some customers will abuse the privilege, but making millions of normal customers feel comfortable purchasing can be worth absorbing a certain amount of inconvenience. According to the National Retail Federation, retailers expected merchandise returns to reach roughly $890 billion in 2024, representing about 16.9% of annual retail sales. Those numbers are enormous, yet generous return policies remain widespread because customer confidence has economic value. Think about what that does psychologically. Buying becomes less like signing a tiny contract with your toaster and more like trying something out. The jacket looked better under store lighting? Take it back. The coffee maker has 17 buttons and somehow none of them produces coffee the way you expected? Check the return policy. The birthday gift landed with all the enthusiasm of a tax audit? America probably has a counter for that. There's a reason retailers such as Costco became famous for satisfaction guarantees, while chains including Walmart and Target built straightforward return systems into ordinary shopping. Their exact conditions vary by product and can change, but the larger expectation has become unmistakable. Earning the customer's trust sometimes matters more than winning one transaction. That expectation can become strangely addictive because it changes how failure feels. A bad purchase is no longer necessarily a small punishment for making the wrong choice. There may be an exit door, and remarkably, somebody behind a customer service desk might even help you find it. European retail culture is hardly unfriendly, and consumer protections there can be stronger in important legal areas. What surprises visitors in America is something subtler. Generosity has often been turned into a competitive weapon. Companies fight for loyalty by making regret less expensive. Once you become accustomed to that, keeping a useless blender because well, I already bought it, starts feeling like leaving $20 in your jeans before doing laundry. American shoppers simply learn to check the receipt first. Box it up. There's a moment at the end of an American restaurant meal that can feel almost suspiciously satisfying to someone who did not grow up with it. Half a steak remains, several fries are still untouched, and instead of watching perfectly good food disappear toward the kitchen, somebody produces a container and sends tomorrow's lunch home with you. Americans barely consider this remarkable. In fact, leaving a restaurant carrying a little cardboard box is so normal that nobody assumes you dislike the meal, could not afford another one, or committed some embarrassing breach of etiquette. You paid for the food, there is food left, and America has already worked out the next chapter of the story. That attitude has deeper cultural roots than the humble to-go box suggests. During the 20th century, taking restaurant leftovers home became increasingly normalized in the United States, helped by changing restaurant habits and the spread of disposable food containers. Today, the expectation is built into dining culture so thoroughly that servers will often ask whether customers want a box before anyone has decided what tomorrow's breakfast is going to look like. The contrast becomes especially interesting in France. Taking restaurant leftovers home was traditionally less common there, but attitudes have changed enough that French law stepped in. Since July 1, 2021, restaurants in France have generally been required to provide customers with a container for unfinished food or drink when requested, with certain exceptions. A practice Americans have treated casually for generations became part of France's broader effort to reduce waste. That matters because food waste is hardly a tiny problem. The US Department of Agriculture estimates that roughly 30 to 40% of the American food supply is lost or wasted. Against a number that large, the little takeout box suddenly stops looking like a piece of restaurant clutter and starts looking remarkably sensible. Yet the addictive part is not environmental policy, it is permission. American restaurant culture quietly gives you permission to stop eating when you are full without feeling that the money left on the plate has vanished with your appetite. Tonight's barbecue ribs can become tomorrow's lunch. Half a sandwich can survive long enough to meet a microwave. Cheesecake can spend the night in the refrigerator, like it has secured late checkout at a Marriott. That changes the psychology of eating more than people realize. You are not racing against the plate, and you do not need to perform some heroic final 10 minutes because your grandmother once told you never to waste food. The meal can simply continue later. In parts of Europe, that habit is becoming more common, particularly among younger diners and in larger cities, so the difference should never be exaggerated into a rigid national rule. Still, many visitors notice how completely unremarkable Americans make the whole transaction. Nobody whispers the request, nobody hides the box under a coat. The container arrives, the leftovers go inside, and everyone carries on talking. There is something oddly lovable about a culture that looks at half a plate of excellent food and refuses to declare the relationship over. Americans simply call it leftovers. After a while, everyone else starts calling it tomorrow's best decision. The cereal wall. Nobody expects breakfast cereal to become a cultural event, yet an American supermarket can make that happen before a visitor has even reached the milk. One aisle contains flakes, loops, squares, clusters, marshmallows, chocolate pieces, cinnamon swirls, high-protein versions, low-sugar versions, family packs, tiny boxes, and cereals apparently designed for children who believe breakfast should look like Saturday morning television. Somewhere between Frosted Flakes and Cinnamon Toast Crunch, a simple grocery trip quietly turns into 20 minutes of decision-making. That abundance is more revealing than it first appears. The Food Industry Association has reported that a conventional US supermarket can carry tens of thousands of individual products, with industry figures commonly putting the assortment around 30,000 items. Compare that with discount supermarkets such as Aldi, whose European model became famous partly because it deliberately carries a far smaller selection, often only a few thousand products depending on the market and store format. Neither philosophy is wrong, but they train shoppers differently. A German Aldi is built around efficiency. Fewer versions of the same thing, faster decisions, less wandering around wondering whether ranch-flavored pretzel pieces represent personal growth. American supermarkets often operate on another assumption entirely. If 10 customers want 10 slightly different versions, somebody will eventually put all 10 on a shelf. That is where the experience becomes strangely addictive. At first, the choice feels ridiculous. Why should peanut butter occupy enough shelf space to require comparison shopping? Then people begin noticing what all those choices actually allow. One household wants crunchy peanut butter without added sugar. Another needs gluten-free bread. Someone else wants oat milk specifically for coffee, while the person standing beside them is comparing 6 kinds of barbecue sauce as seriously as a jury examining evidence. The shelves begin to feel less excessive and more personal. American consumer culture has spent decades turning preference into a marketplace. Companies compete over flavors, dietary needs, convenience, package sizes, price points, and increasingly specific lifestyles. Sometimes this produces products nobody knew civilization was missing, and Americans themselves are perfectly capable of laughing at that. A nation probably does not require 17 interpretations of ranch dressing to function properly, although suggesting otherwise in the Midwest may require legal representation. Yet behind the comedy sits something visitors often come to appreciate. The customer is expected to have preferences. You are allowed to be picky here. That can feel surprisingly liberating if you come from a shopping culture where the store decides that 3 acceptable versions are plenty. In America, consumers frequently reverse that relationship. Stores watch what people want, companies notice what sells, and shelves change accordingly. The supermarket, therefore, becomes a small demonstration of something Americans value far beyond groceries: individual choice. After enough time living with that freedom, going back to a shelf with one familiar version of everything can feel strangely quiet. You may once have laughed at 12 kinds of pancake syrup, but eventually you discover that number 7 was exactly the one you liked. And that is how the cereal aisle gets you. It never asks you to admire America. It simply gives you 40 chances to find your favorite breakfast, built for everyone. One of the most impressive things about everyday America is something most Americans walk past without giving it a second thought. The curb slopes down, the entrance has a ramp, the restroom has an accessible stall, and the parking lot is clearly marked spaces close to the door. None of this arrives with fireworks, yet for visitors accustomed to navigating older European cities, the consistency can become impossible to ignore. The reason goes back to 1990, when the Americans with Disabilities Act became federal law. The ADA prohibited disability discrimination across major areas of public life and established accessibility requirements that reshaped businesses, public facilities, transportation, workplaces, and newly constructed environments across the country. More than 3 decades later, many of the physical details created by that law have become so ordinary that Americans barely see them anymore. That is precisely what makes them impressive. Consider what daily movement can involve in historic European cities. In central Rome, centuries-old buildings may have narrow entrances, raised thresholds, uneven paving, or stairs that were designed long before anybody imagined modern accessibility standards. Paris has spent heavily improving accessibility across buses, trams, and suburban rail, yet much of its century-old metro remains difficult for wheelchair users because retrofitting deep underground stations with elevators is enormously complicated. Those cities are not careless. They inherited architecture from another age. America had a different opportunity and then backed it with a powerful legal requirement. A curb cut may have been designed for a wheelchair, but suddenly a parent pushing a stroller loves it. A traveler dragging a suitcase appreciates it. A delivery worker moving boxes uses it without thinking. Someone recovering from knee surgery quietly discovers that one gentle slope can determine whether entering a building feels normal or exhausting. Accessibility has a wonderful habit of helping far more people than the original label suggests. That is where the American approach becomes surprisingly moving, because good accessibility eventually disappears into everyday life. Nobody should have to announce that they need the side entrance, hunt for an employee with a key, or feel as though getting through the door requires filing a special request with Congress. The CDC has estimated that more than 1 in 4 American adults lives with some form of disability. Once that number is considered, ramps, curb cuts, and accessible facilities stop looking like special features for a tiny minority. They begin to look like ordinary infrastructure serving neighbors, parents, veterans, workers, grandparents, and sooner or later, almost anyone whose body temporarily refuses to cooperate. Europe has made major progress as well. The European Accessibility Act, adopted in 2019 and applicable to covered products and services from June 2025, represents another important step toward broader access across the EU. Yet visitors can still notice how deeply the American expectation has entered ordinary commercial life after more than 30 years of the ADA. Perhaps that is the most American part of it. The best feature in the building may be the one nobody mentions. It simply lets more people through the front door. The sink eats. There's one American kitchen sound that can make a first-time European visitor instinctively pull their hand away from the sink. Someone rinses a plate, pushes a few food scraps toward the drain, flips a switch, and suddenly the plumbing growls like a lawnmower has been trapped underneath the countertop. Americans call it a garbage disposal, then continue the conversation as though the sink developing teeth deserves no further discussion. That reaction makes sense because food waste disposers have been part of American kitchens for generations. The appliance was invented in the United States in the 1920s, and estimates commonly place disposals in roughly half of American households today. Their presence is familiar enough that U.S. housing surveys and appliance guides treat them as an ordinary kitchen feature rather than some exotic gadget. Cross the Atlantic and the relationship changes considerably. Garbage disposals exist in Britain and continental Europe, but they are nowhere near as deeply embedded in household culture. European kitchens traditionally rely much more heavily on scraping leftovers into household waste, or increasingly, collecting food separately for composting and municipal recycling. In England, for example, new rules under the Environment Act are moving households toward separate weekly food waste collections, with nationwide implementation expanding from 2026. That difference explains why the American machine can initially look slightly unhinged. To someone accustomed to carefully scraping potato peelings into a little kitchen bin, watching food disappear directly into the sink feels like discovering that Americans installed a tiny mechanical alligator beneath every other countertop. The noise certainly does nothing to improve its reputation. A disposal rarely whispers politely, it announces itself with the confidence of somebody starting a leaf blower at 7:03 on Saturday morning. Yet after the novelty wears off, the appeal becomes embarrassingly easy to understand. The genius is not that Americans somehow eliminated kitchen waste, because they obviously did not. The attraction lies in removing the wet, messy scraps that make an ordinary trash can smell like it has developed opinions. Small bits left after dinner can be ground up and carried away through the wastewater system instead of sitting indoors until garbage day. That convenience has limits, and Americans learn them quickly. Grease should not be poured down the drain, fibrous foods can cause trouble, and a disposal is absolutely not permission to introduce the plumbing to an entire Thanksgiving dinner. Every American homeowner seems to know somebody who once challenged the machine with something ambitious and spent the afternoon underneath the sink, reconsidering several life choices. Still, the broader cultural idea behind it is wonderfully familiar. American household design has a long habit of looking at a repetitive annoyance and asking whether a motor could make it disappear. Sometimes the answer produced the washing machine, sometimes it produced the garage door opener. Here, somebody apparently looked at carrot peelings and decided they had enjoyed enough freedom. That is why this strange little machine can become one of those American conveniences visitors start missing surprisingly quickly. At first, the sound makes you step backward. A few months later, scraping dinner scraps into an ordinary bin can feel oddly old-fashioned, while the sink sits there looking disappointingly unemployed. Maybe the biggest surprise is that America rarely reveals itself through headlines. It shows up in small conveniences, the generosity built into ordinary routines, and the quiet assumption that daily life can always be made a little easier. That is what visitors remember long after the novelty fades. So tell us, which normal American habit would surprise someone from overseas the most? Share it below and subscribe to the channel for more stories that make the familiar feel new again.